We continue our study of Luke. We're in Luke 22, and we are in the midst of the description that Luke gives concerning the Last Supper that Jesus ate with his disciples. And after he had dealt with their bickering among themselves about who is the greatest, and Jesus emphasized to them about being a servant, he says in verse 31 something that is indeed quite chilling. Now remember that the seating arrangement, as we have described last week, is that Jesus is sitting as the host. To the right, to his right, is John, being the youngest of the group. The youngest always sat to the right of the host. To the left of Jesus, Judas Iscariot was sitting. That was reserved for the most honored guest. And it's very interesting that Judas Iscariot took that upon himself to sit in that position. And then Peter is sitting across from Jesus. So that gives you the dynamics at work. We've already talked about how that conversations that were between Jesus and Peter and Jesus and John would not necessarily be overheard by the entire group sitting at the table. The table itself is about knee high with cushions around it where the people would recline as they ate. And it would be a very convenient arrangement for them to be able to take the supper. But he addresses Simon Peter in verse 31 and says, "Simon, Simon, behold, Satan has demanded permission to sift you like wheat." You stop and think about that for a minute. Seriously ponder that statement that Jesus makes. He's telling Simon Peter, one of the inner circle of apostles, Satan has demanded to sift you like wheat. What that brings to mind, at least it does to me, is what we find in the book of Job, where Satan appears among the sons of God. I don't believe that's angels, by the way. I believe it's earthly worshipers, and Satan was appearing among those earthly worshipers and then had a conversation with God. And he demanded Job, you build a hedge around him. Take away everything he has and he'll curse you. And the Lord allows Satan to do that. And then he says, well, if he is afflicted, then he'll turn against you. And he said, well, you can do what you will to him except don't kill him. That's the only restriction that God put on Satan about Job. Now you think about that in light of this. Satan has demanded to sift Peter like wheat. That's chilling. If that doesn't chill you to your bone, I don't know what will. That's more chilling to me than any horror movie could ever depict on screen. That Satan wants you personally. He wants me personally. He wants every individual in this congregation personally. He demands permission to sift you like wheat. If that doesn't sober you up, if that doesn't get you oriented toward a spiritual mindset, nothing will. Notice what Jesus adds, however. But, thank God he says, but I have prayed for you that your faith may not fail. And you, when once you have turned again, strengthen your brothers. I like the King James rendering of this, when you are converted. I like that rendering. In other words, when you turn back again, strengthen your brothers. The Lord knew Simon. The Lord knew him better than he knew himself, as it would turn out. Simon Peter at this moment thought that he would go to the ends of the earth to fight for the Lord. He thought that everything that he would do would be unwaveringly faithful to the Lord. In that moment, he was thinking, I can do anything for him. But he said to him, here's what Peter says, Lord, with you I am ready to go both to prison and to death. Matthew adds, I shall never be offended. In that moment, Peter thinks, I'm your most loyal disciple. And he said, I say to you, Peter, the rooster will not crow today until you have denied 3 times that you know me. In Mark's account, he says, the rooster will crow twice. You'll deny me 3 times. In that moment, I'm sure Peter was puzzled. We're not told Peter's reaction. He's not described. We're not told what Peter was thinking. But my own speculation is Peter was puzzled at that. No, I'll never deny you. I'll always stand by you. But the Lord knew. He was telling him it's going to happen. What he was telling Peter was simply telling him up front. Jesus never hides things from us. He is always up front with us. He will never lie to us. God will never lie to us. So he's up front about what's going to happen. That's the reason why we talk about the Apostle Paul. When Paul was in Arabia for 3 years, I think I know what was taking place. Not only was he being prepared to be an apostle, but the Lord was showing him in as much detail as possibly could happen, what would happen to him while he followed Jesus. So when it happened, it would not overwhelm him and shock him. He knew this was coming. Peter, when this happened, would remember what the Lord said. He would know this was coming. He would realize it. And he said to them, when I sent you out without money belt and bag and sandals, you did not lack anything, did you? They said, no, nothing. And he said to them, but now whoever has a money belt is to take it along. Likewise also a bag, and whosoever has no sword is to sell his coat and buy one. For I tell you that this which is written must be fulfilled in me, and he was numbered with transgressors. That's quoting Isaiah 53:12. For that which refers to me has its fulfillment. They said, Lord, look, here are 2 swords. And he said to them, it is enough. He's telling them, be prepared. Be prepared. What are the swords for? For defense, if they needed it. But 2 swords among 12 apostles? I mean, that's not much of a defense. It's mainly to fulfill prophecy. But this indicates, at least to me, in a secondary sense, that the Lord is not against having some kind of protection, something for self-defense purposes. But that's not the thrust of the passage here. The thrust of it is they are to prepare. They are to prepare themselves for what lies ahead over the next few hours. And so, verse 39 says, he came out and proceeded as was his custom to the Mount of Olives. And the disciples also followed him. That's not a very long distance at all from where they ate the supper, a walking distance. This is in the cool of the evening, of course. When he arrived at the place, he said to them, pray that you may not enter into temptation. And he withdrew from them about a stone's throw. And he knelt down and began to pray, saying, Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done. Father, remove this cup. Let this cup pass. King James renders it. Much has been written, much has been proposed as to what this cup is that Jesus wants removed. Is it the cup of crucifixion itself? Well, no, it can't be, because Jesus has talked openly to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem. He must suffer many things the chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and be raised the 3rd day. He has had his face set toward Jerusalem for a long period of time. He wants to go on that cross. He wants to die that death to fulfill the scheme of redemption. So what is this cup that he wants to have passed from him? What is that cup? My thought, and take it for what you will, is that this is the cup of suffering. That is the intense agony, pain of the cross. He knows he's going to suffer many things, the chief priests and scribes, but he also realizes fully the pain that is involved in crucifixion. The pain that is involved in scourging. The pain that's going to be involved. And he says, if it's possible, let this cup pass. Crucifixion in and of itself is horrible. But everything else that goes along with it, that's the human side of Jesus coming through. Who in their right mind would willingly want to suffer pain and agony, being beaten mercilessly by Roman soldiers? I don't know of anyone who would want that. Jesus is saying, if it's possible, let this cup pass. Nevertheless, or yet not my will, but yours be done. We're told another account of the Gospels that he prayed the same words, using the same words 3 times. It's not wrong to pray using the same words. That's not vain repetition, as long as what you're praying is heartfelt and scriptural, of course. But Jesus prayed using the same words 3 times in the garden. And then Luke adds in verse 43, now an angel from heaven appeared to him, strengthening him. That's an interesting side point that Luke makes. Angels are described as ministering servants. And here, as in other places, other crucial events of Jesus' life, such as the temptation that he suffered in the wilderness, after the temptation, you remember angels came and ministered unto him. Well, here we have an angel ministering to Jesus in his hour of trial, in his hour of agony. And in fact, in verse 44, Luke says, and being in agony, he was praying very fervently, and his sweat became like drops of blood falling down upon the ground. Luke, as a physician, focuses on the medical aspects of things more than all the other writers of the New Testament. And so he focuses upon that one aspect of Jesus' suffering. He says his sweat became like drops of blood. In 1986, the Journal of the American Medical Association published an article on the physical death of Jesus Christ. You can access that, by the way, online. If you look up the title, On the Physical Death of Jesus Christ, you'll find the article with illustrations by the Mayo Clinic, which I have presented to you here in previous several months back. In that article, the writers, there are 3 authors of the article, one a theologian, the other 2 medical specialists. They make the point that this condition that Luke describes is an actual medical condition. It's called hematidrosis or bloody sweat. In times of severe and intense emotional distress and stressful situations, your sweat glands can actually ooze blood. That's in very intense stress. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. What you're describing is called the flagrum, and they talk about that in that article on the physical death of Jesus Christ. It's called a flagrum. And what it was a handle to which there were leather thongs attached, and in those leather thongs they would entwine bone, glass, and metal. And when you have one Roman soldier, it's bad enough. When you have two Roman soldiers, which was often the custom, one on either side of the accused who was bound naked to a pole, and when they would use all their physical weight, and even if they're very agitated, to beat the accused man over and over and over, the flagrum would rip open the flesh, expose the bone. And the person that's beaten that way would often die from the wounds themselves, which tells me, by the way, I know we're skipping ahead a little bit, that Jesus was in good physical condition, very good physical condition. He wasn't a wimp by any means. He wasn't somebody that looked like on the miniseries Jesus of Nazareth in the mid-'70s that was on NBC. The guy playing Jesus looked like he needed to eat a donut, because he was so skinny and so gaunt. Well, that's not the way I picture Jesus. Jesus was very much a man physically. And if he could go through that scourging, as we're talking about, and not die, that tells me he's very physically fit. Jesus, though, was not looking forward to that. He was not looking forward to that beating. He wasn't looking forward to that scourging. And so when Luke describes that his sweat became like drops of blood falling to the ground, that tells you what you need to know. It tells you what you need to know. His sweat became like drops of blood. I'm looking at the Greek text, and it's very graphic. What Luke describes here is very much a medical condition. And he draws upon that background to talk about it. And so verse 45 says, when he rose from prayer, he came to the disciples and found them sleeping from sorrow. Think about that for a minute. Sleeping from sorrow. Have you ever cried yourself to sleep? I'm sure you have, at least once in your life. If you haven't, you will. The disciples, bless their hearts, had cried themselves to sleep. They knew something bad was about to happen. And they were in such distress that the physical side of them took over. And they went to sleep. And so verse 46, he said to them, why are you sleeping? Get up and pray, that you may not enter into temptation. Why are you sleeping? Remember, the other accounts tell us that 3 times he went to the disciples. You remember that Peter, James, and John separated themselves from the other disciples and went with them a certain distance into the garden. And so you have Peter, James, and John here and the rest of the disciples over here. And so Jesus is now knowing that the hour has come. And so he's telling them to wake up and pray that you may not enter into temptation. While he was still speaking, behold, a crowd came. And the one called Judas, one of the 12, was preceding them. And he approached Jesus to kiss him. Picture in your mind the scene. It's nighttime, dead of night. And all of a sudden, from a distance, you see this crowd of soldiers coming with torches. And they're armed to the teeth. And at the head is Judas, grinning. I always picture Judas grinning as he's coming up. And he's going to try to kiss Jesus. But Jesus said to him, Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss? Even at this late hour, he's trying to reach Judas. He's trying to get through to him. Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man? Judas would know the meaning of that term well. The Son of Man. That's a messianic term that's used in the book of Daniel especially, and elsewhere in the Old Testament. Jesus' favorite term to describe himself. It describes, yes, his humanity, but much deeper than that. It's talking about the Messiah who was prophesied, who was going to come. Jesus uses that term to describe himself, and now when he's facing Judas, the betrayer, are you betraying the Son of Man? With a kiss. Still trying to reach him. When those who were around him saw what was going to happen, they said, Lord, shall we strike with the sword? I'm pretty sure I know who that was that said that. And one of them, we're told later it's Peter in one of the accounts, struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his right ear. Well, we know it's Simon Peter who did it. We also know the name of this servant. John names him in John 18:10. He's Malchus, the servant of the high priest. We also know, because his right ear is cut off, that Simon Peter was left-handed. Think about it, Anyway, we're told that by those who've done the figuring. I'm pretty sure that's pretty accurate. He'd be left-handed. That's a very trivial point to make in context, but still. Jesus answered and said, Stop, no more of this. And he touched his ear and healed him. In the midst of this, when the soldiers are there to arrest Jesus and take him away, what does Jesus do? Does he order his disciples, attack? Defend me, let's conquer. No, he says, stop it. He heals Malchus's ear. You think that made an impression on Malchus the rest of his life? We're not told anything else about Malchus, what happens to him afterward. But Jesus cared enough about him to heal him. Then Jesus said to the chief priests and officers of the temple and elders who had come against him, Have you come out with swords and clubs as you would against a robber? While I was with you daily in the temple, you did not lay hands on me, but this hour and the power of darkness are yours. What do you have on me? What do you have on me? Much is talked about these days about unlawful arrest, what the police can do and can't do. Well, look at what happened to Jesus. Our policemen are in a very stressful situation these days. No question about it. Think about what happened with Jesus. This is the first of many injustices that would happen to him. He's unlawfully arrested. Verse 54 says, having arrested him. What's the charge? What are they going to bring against him? He's innocent. He's sinless. He's the Son of God. They led him away and brought him to the house of the high priest, but Peter was following at a distance. So after all of this commotion, all of this chaos, Mark mentions that all the disciples fled at this point in the midst of the chaos and confusion. One of them actually fled out of his outer clothes, a young man, as John Mark himself, by the way. He describes himself as having fled. All the disciples leave. John mentions it's not just Peter that follows, it's also the disciple whom Jesus loved who follows. So Peter and John are there, but Luke only mentions Peter. Peter is following at a distance. After they had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and had sat down together, Peter was sitting among them. Now Matthew adds that they were there to see the end. In other words, they were there to see what all would happen. So what's Peter doing? Is he right there with Jesus as he said he would? I'll follow you to the death. No, what is he doing? He's following at a distance. And now he sits down at a fire. And you know what's next. A servant girl, seeing him as he sat in the firelight and looking intently at him, said, This man was with him too. Matthew adds, he was with Jesus the Galilean. Mark says Jesus the Nazarene. He was with Jesus the Galilean, the Nazarene. You can hear the accusation in her voice. You can see her staring at Peter. And I'm sure, even though we're not told by Luke what Peter's reaction, his visual reaction, I'm sure Peter's trying to be as inconspicuous as he possibly can. But no, he's not. He's not. What does he do? Verse 57. He denied it. First denial. Saying, "Woman, I do not know him." Matthew, Mark's account adds, "I know not what you say. I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know him." A little later, another saw him and said, "You are one of them too." But Peter said, "Man, I am not." Second denial. After about an hour had passed, another man began to insist, saying, "Certainly, this man also was with him, for he is a Galilean too." But Peter said, "Man, I do not know what you are talking about." The other gospel accounts tell us he began to curse and to swear. That old fisherman's lifestyle comes back. His old habits come to the surface. Immediately, while he was still speaking, a rooster crowed. The Jerusalem rooster. He crowed. He reminds Peter about what the Lord had said just mere hours before. And then verse 61. The Lord turned and looked at Peter. One of the most sobering verses in the entire Bible to me. The Lord turned and looked. Wouldn't you want to see that with your own eyes, that scene as it plays out? The Lord turns. Maybe the procession is passing nearby, and the cock crows, and then Jesus turns and looks. And Peter remembered the word of the Lord, how he had told him, "Before a rooster crows today, you will deny me 3 times." And he went out and wept bitterly. Peter was bawling like a baby. His sin came crashing down on him. It is ever the case that when your sin comes crashing down on you, the reaction that you have tells much about your character. If you weep over your own sin, if you're in agony over your sin, the Lord can reach you. No question. We're never told that Judas Iscariot wept bitterly over his realization that he had sinned. He admitted, yes, he had sinned, that he betrayed the Lord. But we're not told that Judas Iscariot went out and wept bitterly just as Peter did. No. Judas compounds the problem. He goes out and hangs himself. But Peter, the Lord knew Peter. The Lord knew he could reach him. Now the men who were holding Jesus in custody were mocking him and beating him. And they blindfolded him and were asking him, saying, "Prophesy, who is the one who hit you?" And they were saying many other things against him, blaspheming. The crowd of Roman soldiers that don't care. They don't care. This is their sport. Go have some fun. They heard this man claims to be a king, claims to be somebody. Let's test him and see. And so they blindfold him, they start hitting him. It says they beat him. No, they were punching him. They were slapping him. You ever been slapped? I hope you never have been slapped. I hope you never will be slapped. It's not a fun thing to experience. I've never experienced it, thankfully. But still, it's not good. And when somebody is hostile to you, and they're not only doing that, they're They're mocking you, making fun of you, and they're cursing you. They're doing all sorts of things that demean you as a person, as a human being. That's what Jesus was going through. You talk about injustice. There's none. There's no justice here. None whatsoever. The late Rex Turner Sr., in his book Systematic Theology, has a chapter on the trial of Jesus, the greatest injustice in human history. He talks about it from the standpoint of Jewish jurisprudence, the Talmud, and of course the Torah, and comparing what Jesus went through with Jewish law. It violated every tenet of Jewish jurisprudence. There was no justice here. None. None to be found. What they were doing was illegal. But they didn't care because they wanted Jesus dead. When it was day, the council of elders of the people assembled, both chief priests and scribes, and they led him away to their council chamber. Mark adds that they held a consultation. Matthew says they took counsel to put him to death. This is the Sanhedrin. This is the body that has had it in for Jesus for all this time, saying, if you are the Christ, tell us. But he said to them, if I tell you, you will not believe. Jesus, to the end, uses flawless logic and reasoning. He's drawing upon experience. Experience showed that they wouldn't believe. If they won't believe because he raised Lazarus from the dead after being in the tomb for 3 days and his body beginning to deteriorate, if they wouldn't believe that he's a son of God after that, do you think they're going to believe now? No. Many of these same men in the Sanhedrin, a little over 50 days later, not long later in fact, comparatively speaking, would oppose the apostles. And they would try to do to the apostles the same thing they did to Jesus. They're not going to change. They've already shown that. But he said to the verse 68, and if I ask a question, you will not answer. He's already tried that too. He's tried to respond to their questions with questions, and they would not respond. So it's not going to do any good. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the power of God. Jesus knows how this is all going to end. He knows who's got the upper hand in this. And it's not the Sanhedrin. And they all said, are you the Son of God then? And he said to them, yes, I am. Unequivocally, unambiguously, he says, yes, I am. Then they said, what further need do we have of testimony? For we have heard it ourselves from his own mouth. Matthew adds that they bound Jesus and they led him away. Now think about this. They admit their lack of evidence against Jesus. And they're saying, well, he says he's the Son of God. Well, we've heard it now. There's no need, No need of testimony. Well, we're told in the other accounts that they couldn't get their witnesses to agree among themselves. They couldn't get 2 witnesses to agree against Jesus about what he had said, supposedly, and done. And so they decide to take him away because he's blaspheming. Well, Jesus has already demonstrated time and again that he's not blaspheming. He's proved his claim over and over again by his miracles, and the crowning miracle that he performed, which is, of course, raising Lazarus from the tomb after 3 days in the grave. And then he also, when he healed the paralytic, he said, so that you may know the Son of Man has power on earth to forgive sins, I say to you, get up and walk. He shows that he has the authority on earth to forgive sins. He's already demonstrated, proved beyond a doubt who he is. So, they're just wanting to kill him. That brings us to chapter 23. Then the whole body of them got up and brought him before Pilate. And they began to accuse him. Now what did they accuse him of? Oh, he's claiming to be the Son of God. Oh, he's black. No, all of a sudden it changes. Look at this. We found this man misleading our nation and forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ, a king. Notice this. It changes. Now they're not talking about, oh, he says he's the Son of God. No, they've got to have some kind of charge that Pilate could go ahead and do what they can't do. Now these accusations, that is, misleading the nation, forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar, those are patently false. He already said, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, unto God the things that are God's. He's already said that you can pay taxes. But he's making a distinction between things that are temporal and things that are spiritual on that occasion. Saying that he himself is Christ, yes, he is claiming to be the Christ, but not in the sense that they are intending it. That is, a king, an earthly king, conquering, taking over Rome. That's exactly not what Jesus claims for himself. So Pilate asked him, saying, are you the king of the Jews? And he answered him and said, you say, it is as you say. Are you the king of the Jews? Well, you see, there's that misapprehension. What kind of king is he? Jesus has made it clear over and again. His kingdom is not of this world. In fact, John's account tells us that in private conversation with Pilate, he tells Pilate very clearly, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then would my servants fight that it might not be delivered to the Jews. He's made it clear to Pilate already, that's not the nature of my kingdom. Then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, I find no guilt in this man. Whoa! Now the chief priests and scribes have thought they've got a deal with Pilate. What we're not told by the gospel accounts is as striking as what we are told. What is implied clearly in all four gospel accounts is that there's some sort of deal that had been reached, a tacit understanding between the Sanhedrin and Pilate, or at least the Sanhedrin thought there was a deal. That if we deliver him to you, that you're going to put him to death. And they've told him basically already what they're now saying openly, that he's leading a rebellion. He's trying to overthrow Rome, all of this. And then Pilate sees this man who's already been beaten within an inch of his life. He's not making defense of himself. He's not an obvious threat. He doesn't have a group of men around him clamoring for his release. He's by himself. Pilate looks at this man and he thinks, this is a threat? This man? And then added to this is the fact that Pilate's wife had sent word to him already, have nothing to do with this man because I've suffered many things in a dream because of him. She calls him a just man, by the way. The Roman mindset put a lot of stock in dreams and portents. So Pilate's already been a little bit shaken. His wife has said this. This is different. And so he sees him, he says, I find no guilt in this man. But they kept on insisting, saying, he stirs up the people, teaching all over Judea, starting from Galilee, even as far as this place. They're clinging to their accusation, as thin as it is. When Pilate heard it, he asked whether the man was a Galilean. He's trying to shift responsibility, by the way. And when he learned that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who himself also was in Jerusalem at that time. Interestingly, neither Pilate nor Herod lived in Jerusalem. Neither one of them lived in the city. They came there because they had to. So as a courtesy to Herod, Pilate sends Jesus to him. Now Herod was very glad when he saw Jesus, for he had wanted to see him for a long time, because he had been hearing about him and was hoping to see some sign performed by him. He was wanting to have a show put forth. He was wanting Jesus to put on a magic show for him. And he questioned him at some length, but he answered him nothing. Jesus does not say a word to Herod. And the chief priests and the scribes were standing there accusing him vehemently. Herod had less reason to fear them than Pilate did. Because Herod understood them a little bit better than Pilate. So they're standing there accusing Jesus, Jesus not saying a word. He does not open his mouth. And Herod with his soldiers, after treating him with contempt and mocking him, dressed him in a gorgeous robe and sent him back to Pilate. They put a splendorous robe on him, sent him back over to Pontius Pilate. They're abusing him emotionally, you see. Now, Herod and Pilate became friends one another that very day, for before they had been enemies with each other. Politics makes strange bedfellows, doesn't it? The enemy of my enemy is my friend. We hear. Well, this is politics. Pilate and Herod began an alliance together after this. Pilate summoned the chief priests and the rulers and the people and said to them, "You brought this man to me as one who incites the people to rebellion, and behold, having examined him before you, I have found no guilt in this man regarding the charges which you make against him. No, nor has Herod, for he sent him back to us, and behold, nothing deserving death has been done by him." Pilate knows. He knows this man doesn't deserve to be put to death. This man's a threat to Rome. Are you kidding me? That's what he's thinking. He knows he doesn't need death. Therefore, I will punish him and release him. Now he was obliged to release to them at the feast one prisoner. You could release one prisoner as a custom. Pilate was going to do this to placate them. He said, if I beat this man within an inch of his life, that's going to satisfy their bloodlust. But as far as killing him, he doesn't deserve that. He underestimated the bloodlust of the scribes and the rulers. They cried out all together, saying, "Away with this man, and release for us Barabbas." Barabbas. He was one who had been thrown into prison for an insurrection made in the city and for murder. This man was a no-count person, according to the law. He had murdered someone. He had raised a group of people to try to overthrow the government. He was no good. Pilate, wanting to release Jesus, addressed them again. But they kept on calling out, saying, "Crucify, crucify him, staru, staru altan, staru, staru altan." That's what they were saying. Crucify, crucify him, staru, crucify, staru altan, crucify him. That's what they were yelling. Crucify him. And he said to them the third time, "Why? What evil has this man done? I have found in him no guilt demanding death, therefore I will punish him and release him." 3 times Pilate has an opportunity to do what justice, true justice demands, and release Jesus. And 3 times he fails. He caves. Now, liberal scholars would say, "Oh, that's unbelievable. Pilate always was a very decisive man. He always took action." Well, he was also a politician. And when politicians are faced with a possible mob riot, when they got bloodlust in their eyes, Pilate knew he needed to stop. And so this is where we're going to stop. We're going to end up right here at verse 22, and we'll continue this study